So welcome to the CISO Perspectives interview series hosted on CISO Street. I'm happy to be here today with Jonathan Kimmitt, CISO at the University of Tulsa, not to be mistaken with our arch rival University of Oklahoma. I did make that mistake earlier, but I'm Lorene Smith, and I'm your host on the CISO Perspective series and on CISO Street. So I'm super happy to be here with Jonathan. Jonathan and I met, I think, last year, and you've been on a number of panels where I've moderated the conversation, and I just loved having you participate. So thought you'd be great to participate on CISO Street. So welcome, Jonathan.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I think arch rival is maybe that's a strong word depending on what department. I've got some really good friends at OU and OSU and such. So I think that once they hear this, they're going to kind of rib me about that. So.
Well, my brother went to USC and I went to UC Berkeley. And so for years there, and still the rival's still going on, because he just texted me last weekend saying, oh, by the way, you do have a chance of beating us this year because our team is not that great. But Cal never had a really good team for the longest time while I was going to college there. But they've had a better program. So anyway, I do understand the rival situation. Oh my gosh. Well, let's get started here. And if you could introduce yourself and tell the audience where you work and what you do, and then we'll get into how you got started in cybersecurity, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a Chief Information Security Officer for the University of Tulsa. I've been CISO for 7-ish years. I think we're getting close to 8 now, which seems to be a really long time. It feels really long to me sometimes. I've been at TU for going on 20 years. I started out as the help desk supervisor. I graduated the University of Tulsa. I left for a time and went and did a few other things. I came back. I actually came back temporarily. A friend of mine said, hey, we need you to, would you mind covering the help desk for a couple of months while we find someone? And I did, and I've been here ever since. A few years after I started, they needed some help on the computer security response team, and they wanted to have someone from the desktop side, from the help desk side on the team, because a lot of things we did at the time was on desktops. This was early 2000s, 2002, 2003. And if you remember back then, we had a lot of viruses at the beginning of the semesters. We had a lot of internet worms. We had a lot of things happening. This is before Windows XP even turned on their firewall by default. So we had a lot of stuff happening. So they really wanted someone on the desktop side to be part of the CSRT. I had just a minimal amount of law enforcement experience between the time that I left TU graduate and the time I started. So I had some experience in paperwork and custody tracking and, or evidence tracking and things like that. So it just kind of seemed like a natural fit. I got onto the team, did that for several years, really enjoyed it. The guy who was running the team left. He went to another university, so they asked me to take team lead. Did that for a few years, and then we decided as an institution we needed to have an office of IT security, and I had been doing it for a while, and they kind of tapped me on the shoulder and says, hey, guess what? I think you're going to do this now. So I moved from Chief Services Officer. I'd worked my way up to Chief Services Officer, and I moved over to Chief Information Security Officer. So that's kind of my background, at least here at the university. I've been CISO. I'm also president of our local ISSA chapter. I'm also on the board of our InfraGuard Oklahoma chapter. So I try to stay involved in the local community and in the industry to really help. I mean, there's a lot I need to learn, and I get out there with the best people that I can find and engage with them and talk with them and bring that back to the university to hopefully protect the students, protect the network, protect our systems. That's a little bit about me.
Good. Yeah, that's great. I know working at the universities, you've got a lot of moving parts, right? It's a little different than, it's all different, but it's different than industry, right? Corporate business. And I know I've had a lot of CISOs from the universities on, and the issues that you face it's daunting, really. But I like the fact that I know that you've been actively involved in the community, and I think that's really important. One of the things that I've definitely learned from speaking to people like Charles Carmichael, who from Mandiant, who speaks on at Congress all the time, testifies in Congress. He always talks about how important it is to communicate. And the only way that we're really going to combat these cyber criminals is if we come together and share what we learn, and everybody is better when that happens. So that's good to hear.
Absolutely. It's one of those things, I speak a lot, of course I've been on, several of your panels, which is always a lot of fun. And I enjoy getting out there and enjoy talking at both at conferences, but also conferences that are not IT related. I go to HR conferences, I go to legal conferences. I'm looking to do actually the farm show next year, here in Oklahoma. That maybe sound kind of funny, but we have farm shows or farm and ranch type of events. And, one of the things I really try to do is get out in front of people, because I can get out in front of a cyber conference and we can have a lot of fun, but we all talk about the same stuff and, we engage and I really want to get out in front of people who don't know about this stuff, who don't know the attack vectors, who don't know how to protect themselves and protect their organizations. Because I think that's really where, as we move into the future, the ability to defend against stuff is not going to be big organizations. It's going to be at the smaller level. Mm-hmm. And we've got to get as much as we can down there in terms of knowledge, skills, and abilities.
That's really interesting. It sort of goes along with what I've always I've heard a long time ago, but live by, is you have to unplug to find inspiration. And I feel like that is some version of that, where you talk, you're out, because you probably learn a lot as well, right? When you're teaching people that don't really know cyber.
Absolutely.
They're not focused on that. Yeah, you come away with just a different perspective. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I've got this hacker tool show and tell that I do. That seems to be really popular. People, I get asked a lot to do this particular presentation, but it's a briefcase full of hacker tools, things like keyloggers and rubber duckies and pineapples and, Raspberry Pis, all the different names of all the different tools. And so I take it around and I bring it up and I kind of show them. It's like, okay, this is a keylogger, and people hear about these things, but they've never seen it. Even IT people, they've never seen it and they've never actually touched it. So I do that a lot. And what I love about it is I actually did this for another university a couple of weeks ago. A friend of mine called me up and says, hey, would you mind coming down and doing some tabletop exercises for us? Absolutely. So I went down and led some tabletops for him. And at the end of the day, we decided to get everyone together and I did my hacker tool show and tell. But he invited his chief of police of the university to the event. And so I'm out there and I'm showing, all these door tools to break into stuff and how to use them and things. And he got this real concerned look on his face, the chief of police did. And finally afterward, he raised his hand and goes, I want to try that. It's like, absolutely. So I grabbed my tools and he took me out. Now, when I usually go to an organization, I have them sign a letter saying that I can do all this stuff if I'm doing a pen test or something. But in this case, I handed it over to him. I was like, okay, I don't have authority to do this, but you do, go for it. And he was breaking in the doors, doing underdoor tools and doing shims and all kinds of stuff. And he looked at me and he goes, we've got doors like this all over the place. I never knew this stuff existed.
Oh my gosh.
That's why I do that, because if you don't know it exists, it's really hard to implement security controls around it.
Right.
So we had some great conversations. Now, I will say he did make sure I got escorted off of campus with all of my tools. But, for a lot of that stuff, people they've never seen it. They don't know it exists. They don't know it's there. They don't know it's a risk until someone brings it up and says, hey, look at this and let me show you how to use it.
Oh my gosh, that's great. That's super interesting. Well, let's talk about, how we combat, or how you and your cybersecurity role combat the next generation of cyber terrorism. And, you're talking a little bit about that now, but just looking ahead, what the cyber criminals are getting smarter. It's definitely a big business. So tell us about what you're looking at, or how you're approaching, this next generation of cyber terrorism.
Like I said before, I think it's going to have to go back to a smaller level, honestly. And I know that that's kind of counterintuitive. When we talk about attacks and we talk about controls and we talk about the things that we have to do on a day-to-day basis, a lot of times we think about the big stuff, expensive tools and expensive security controls and processes and procedures. And absolutely, you need to have all that stuff in some cases. But a lot of times you need to start thinking smaller. You need to start thinking at a smaller level. I had somebody told me once in college, it says, if you think about the small things, the big things take care of themselves. And that's kind of the same thing. When we're talking about, I've got a very large network, the University of Tulsa, it's not my network, but it's the University of Tulsa network. It's huge. We're one of the largest networks in Northeast Oklahoma in terms of devices. Now, we're not going to compete with like some of the larger vendors, Philips or Quick Trip or anything like that. But generally speaking, a university, because we have students that live 24/7, they each have anywhere from 10 to 20 devices apiece. So our tiny little network is 65,000 devices. One of the scans that I did not too long ago, we had around 65,000 devices on our network. And when I talk to other people in the industry, whether they're oil and gas or they're financial, they're hospital, whatever, that's a lot of devices.
It is.
What's worse is we don't manage 70% of them. They're students. They're bring your own device.
Right.
So when you start thinking about that, it can be really overwhelming. So what I've had to do, because I don't have a lot of cash, we don't have a lot of resources, I've got a very small team. So we had to pull back. We had to start thinking at a much smaller level is, okay, how do we protect this thing? How do we start looking at these things? How do we look at specific attacks that we are actually seeing? And that's one of the things that when I go work in an organization and they tell me, it's like, hey, we have this tool and this tool and this tool and this tool. I was like, that's great. What are you defending against? And they just kind of look at me and they go, what do you mean? It's like, those are great tools. I mean, they're very powerful. They do a lot, but what is it that you're actually defending against with those tools? And a lot of times they go, we don't know. You're just supposed to have them. It's kind of like having a firewall. Everyone's just like, hey, you got to have a firewall. You do. I mean, a lot of times you need to have a firewall, but if you don't know what your firewall is defending, if you don't look at the rules and see what the attacks are coming in, then the firewall is just sitting there. In fact, I've been to some organizations that, when I go and look at their rules on their firewall, they have a default allow. They have the tool, but they're not managing it. So it's not actually defending against anything. So I teach martial arts. I have a very small class, but I've been doing martial arts for many, many, many years. But one of the things that I tell students is, the best way to learn a block is to get hit. I mean, if you're doing a high block and you do the motions, that's great. But the first time you get hit in the face, you realize, oh, that's why a high block is important. I turn that around to cybersecurity. We look at the actual attacks. Look on your logs, look on your firewall, look at your computers, and then build your security controls around those attacks. That's the point of cybersecurity. That's you defend against your attacks. In some cases, people put defenses up of attacks that don't mean anything, or they're protecting a segment of their network that has no value, So I think that we really need to step back as an industry and start looking critically. We talked about privacy, before the call about what's really important. I think that's the key issue is let's step back, let's start protecting those really critical things, and then start building out from there. And I think that even to a smaller level of looking at homes and small businesses, we really need to focus on that smaller level because they're just at risk as anybody else, and they have more data than everybody else.
Right.
If you look at an aggregate. So I think we need to start thinking smaller.
Good. We touched again, before our call about data privacy and compliance, and you touched a little bit on it now. But what about the actual technology? I mean, what do you think is important for showing compliance and protect? I mean, you've got a lot of privacy concerns with the university, correct? And so talk a little bit about the technology and what you think is important to protect that and provide compliance around it. Because that's really one of the big concerns, right, is being hit with a fine, basically, around privacy. You need to show compliance. So talk a little bit about that.
I kind of have maybe a slightly different view on the compliance in the world. I mean, I have really great relationships with our internal and external auditors. I do a lot of compliance, everything from, standard FERPA, HIPAA to GLBA to GDPR, PCI, put all the letters together, and generally that kind of falls somewhere in, this office somewhere.
Right.
It comes down to the technology you're using. Are you actually using it? Let's talk about encryption. However you want to deploy encryption in your environment, do you actually deploy it? Is it on the laptops? Is it on the desktops? Are you deploying it in a way that makes sense? Do you have the documentation around it? A lot of what I do, so I teach a couple of different classes at different conferences around, and I have one of them that actually talks about incident response and in working with your auditors in your incident response process. And what I tell people is, as a CISO, I need to think about what I'm doing and how I'm going to describe it to those auditors or to those investigators or to those lawyers or the court as I'm doing it. So if I'm deploying a tool or a security control or a technology, I want to be able to say, this is why I'm doing it, this is how I'm doing it, and here are the results, and here's all the documentation around that. So for me, a lot of in dealing with compliance, a lot of the technology that I really encourage people to use are things that help them document stuff. And when I say document it, it's not just document, these are the steps that we do, but also how do you demonstrate that your firewalls are working? How do you demonstrate that your intrusion detection system is working? You want to be able to demonstrate that. So I use a lot of different technologies for that. I've got Raspberry Pis on my back desk that I use for things like that. And when I'm demonstrating a firewall, I was at this is kind of funny, but I was doing a demonstration or a presentation with a friend of mine who at the time was working at the FBI cybercrimes unit here in Oklahoma. And we were doing this demonstration, and he was talking about some of the tools that he looks for in his investigations in attackers. And he brought up one tool, and I'm across the table from him because we were talking and I go, but wait a minute, I use that tool to test our network. And then I looked over, and all of a sudden he had a pair of handcuffs in his hand. I didn't even see him grab, and everyone just started laughing. It's like, well, wait a minute. And so that's one of those things that I try to get people to understand is not only do you have to have the controls, you got to use some of these tools to test them to make sure that they're working.
Right. I mean, it's part of it is getting inside the hacker's mind, right? and their tool set, their toolkit.
Absolutely.
So talk a little bit about any technology innovation that you're working on at University of Tulsa.
So we're doing a couple of different things here. Of course, we have some new cybersecurity programs in undergrad and grad that I'm doing some co-op things with the faculty members there. And a lot of it has to do with about bringing students in to our IT security department and running a SOC and running forensics and running these tools. And the reality is I don't have a lot of resources. I don't have a lot of staff. I don't have a lot of money and a lot of cash. So bringing in those students really helps me have manpower and woman power. They also allows me skill sets, so people that can help me do things. But it also gives those students hands-on exercises. They can actually get out and start threat hunting. They can find problems. They can find vulnerabilities. So those are the big things that we're working on right now. We're actually hoping to get 5 students. This is the beginning of the program, 5 students in the spring. We're building out the SOC, which is behind me here, back on this wall. In fact, you may hear some construction in the back. I've asked them to be quiet, but just
okay. I can't hear it so far.
Good, good. But we're really putting a lot of effort into that. The other thing that I'm really focusing on, and part of it has to do with just the, this is kind of where we started. So years ago when I started as CISO, we didn't have any budget at all. So I went out and bought 5 Raspberry Pis. And that was my security system for the university. And through those Raspberry Pis, I put them out as sensors, and I did a couple things. And we did I actually made a lot of changes to our network because of what I saw on those Raspberry Pis as sensors. Well, I'm bringing all that stuff back up. We kind of got away from it using, big honeypots and big all kinds of stuff. But I think one of the things, talking about going small, having some eyes and ears out on the network, looking for attacks, looking for different things, is really beneficial to me just in terms of visibility. So we've, over the last 6 months or so, we've been really, as we can get pies and technology, because it's really hard to get right now, I've been getting those and deploying them out, using them for different tools and different things, checking network quality, doing intrusion detection locally, using it as pivot points myself in terms of scanning local networks and restricted networks. So what it's done is it's really been able to allow me to scale up my resources to a point where I don't necessarily have a lot of people, but I've still got a lot of fingers everywhere on the network to give me data. And that's been really helpful. We've found a lot of problems. Again, we have a very large network. It's given us the ability to be really efficient in how we do things. So that's kind of the two big things that we're doing is a student SOC and really getting to that smaller, more agile, more visibility out on our network to understand what's happening.
Okay, great. Let's switch gears a little bit, still staying in the security realm, obviously. Talk a little bit about ransomware, which obviously is driving a lot of business for the cyber criminals and a lot of headaches for the cyber people that are fighting the big fight.
Right.
So what is your thought on paying? To pay or not to pay? That's the big question. And how do you come to that conclusion? Is this a conversation at the leadership level and you decide collectively? But how do you look at that?
So that's a really hard answer, and I'll give you my answer, and then I'll qualify it in a second. So my recommendation is not pay. However, it is a business decision. When I'm working with an organization, if I'm consulting, if I'm doing whatever, it really does come down to it's a business decision. What is the best thing for your organization? If you have lost your backups and you don't have any other choice and the way to function is to be able to pay that ransom and hope that you get the data back, again, business decision. Personally, I would say not to pay because you're just, it's just kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy at that point. But what I do say is if you've gotten to the point where you have to ask the question of pay or no pay, you've already lost. Because the thing about ransomware, we know it. We know how it works. We know the entry points. We know how the attackers get in. We know how to protect systems. We know how to back up systems. We know how to do, and every time we get better at doing that, the attackers get better at the attack. But generally, we do know how to defend against this as an industry, as a world. I'm not saying it's easy by any means, but we know how to defend against this. But as an organization, whenever they ask, because they ask me that question a lot, pay or no pay. And I was like, no, that's not the question. That is a symptom. Ransomware is a symptom of bigger problems. The bigger problems are all those other security controls. Do you have backups? I was in a panel. This was about 4 months ago. This was one of the very first panels in person that we did kind of after the big at-home thing.
Right.
And we had a state cyber guy. Wasn't the state CISO, but he was in a security person in one of the state departments. And then we had an FBI agent. And it was a great conversation. It was a great panel, and we were talking about it. And I made the comment about, that ransomware is a symptom. It's a symptom of a lack of security controls. And we were talking about backups. And I made the comments like, do you have backups? When I'm talking to an organization, I ask them, do you have backups? And then, yes. And it's like, are you sure? Have you tested them? Have you tested them all the way back to production? And that last question right there is, have you tested your backups all the way back to production? Have you brought it from nothing all the way back to fully functional? I honestly don't know any organization that I've interacted with that has done that. They test their backups, but very few of them out there have actually recovered all the way back to production.
Right.
And the FBI agent says, yeah, we go in all the time and to organizations that have been hit or there's an incident or whatever. And they say, okay, well, recover your backups. And then there's a problem. They don't have the backups. They can't recover it. They recover it, but they don't have the dependencies. That's one of the big things about, backups. You can recover a backup, bring up one of your servers, but maybe that server is reliant on a database server or maybe Active Directory, some other dependency, and they don't have those backed up. So again, I say ransomware, the result of ransomware is really a bigger symptom of a problem that we have with the industry out in the world. Are we doing good controls? Or do we have good backups? Do we have good documentation? I think that's the more important question on that I feel like, because if we can fix some of those problems, then ransomware becomes less of an issue. It will always be here.
Right.
The thing about ransomware is this is a very old tactic. If we think about organized crime back in the early 1900s, they'd come and say, hey, if you don't pay us, you might have a problem walking out of the store.
Right.
Same concept.
Yeah. It seems just like this, it's been here forever, right? But the stakes are higher than
it is.
They're not talking thousands of dollars. We're talking about millions of dollars now being paid out, plus lives at risk,
Yep.
Critical infrastructure being, impacted. So it kind of leads me to the next question, which is cyber insurance. And, obviously ransomware has made a big impact on the kind of the evolution of cyber insurance. Rates are, premiums have gone up. It's harder to get it. The forms now are like 20-page security review forms. So talk a little bit about how you see this change happening to cyber insurance and how it's impacting you at the university.
Well, it was, we've had cyber insurance for many years now. We were one of the first in the state to get it back years ago. And every year, the questions, the very first year, no one was given it. So we worked with the carrier and, we got a cyber insurance. The next year, they had just a couple of questions for us. The next year, there was more questions. Well, now it is to these sheets and sheets of questions. So I don't disagree with the change in insurance. I've used our cyber insurance many times, actually. Here at the university, I've got a really good relationship with our insurance guys and gals. They help us with a lot of different things. We've done really well with them. And I've used them. I've actually used them in terms of putting incidents in and claims in probably, 10 times. Okay. I don't know the numbers. And you and I talked about this before. Insurance it's risk. You're taking risks that you have in your organization, and you're transferring it over to the insurance carrier, and that's kind of how the process works. And so they evaluate your risk as an institution. And if you're doing good things and you have lower risk, then they're willing to take that risk onto themselves. And that if something happens, then they'll pay that out. So I understand their viewpoint of if I am not doing good things or the right things here at my organization, they don't really want to cover us. So of course, I try to do the best we can, but I also work with them. I talk with them. We had so this last year, it was very, very detailed, specific things. And there was a couple of questions that I had to put no on that we didn't do. And the carrier came back and was like, these are non-negotiable. You have to do these. If you don't do these, we will not cover you. And so we scrambled to get them done, and they were pretty intensive stuff. It took us about 30 days to get it done, which is faster than I've ever seen done. And we went back to them and we worked with them and said, hey, we want to do this, this, and this. They put us with their engineers and they say, yeah, that will meet the requirement that we're asking here. We did it. We got it done. They covered us. They were happy. We were happy. But, the thing what they were asking was not unreasonable.
Yeah, it's part of your basic cyber plan, right? Cyber risk
Absolutely.
program.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, when they say that, hey, you've really got to deploy these controls. Yes, absolutely. I want to deploy them. So I really see the change in cyber insurance that we're seeing nowadays as a good thing for the industry because, honestly, if I had gone to our leadership, now, I take that back. When I go to the leadership, they're very supportive. They've always been very supportive. It's like, hey, we need to do multi-factor. We need to do this. They've always been supportive of that. But a lot of organizations, they don't necessarily have that support. But when you say, hey, we can't get insurance unless we do X, Y, and Z, that really helps them do that. Now, what is the future? I think really the future is going to be, it's not just going to be a questionnaire. It's going to be that the cyber insurance and a few other entities are going to require third-party certification of our security controls. Think CMMC or PCI or any of those, where it's not just I'm going to fill out a self-assessment questionnaire. I'm going to have to go get a third party come in and test our controls before we can apply for insurance, or, for a variety of that. I talked to a friend of mine who's in the banking sector, and they're actually considering doing that same sort of requirement for businesses before they can get a business loan. Because if a business gets hit with ransomware and they lose all the ability to make money,
right?
They lose that. Exactly.
Right.
So I really think that it's going to the at some point in the near future, probably within the year, I don't know, but instead of just filling out the paperwork, we're going to have to go get a third-party assessor to come in and evaluate us, whether it's like a SOC 2 report or some other assessment, an internal pen test, whatever, before we would be eligible for getting some of those services.
When you have to go back to the insurance company and work with them on, like you said, no a few times, and they come back and say, you need to do this, do you find that the people that you work with understand cybersecurity?
So the answer is yes. The way it's always worked for us is, let's say we have an incident of some kind, whatever that incident may be. We call up our liaison at our bank, who has sold us through the carrier, and we say, okay, we've had an incident. He says, all right, I'm going to get you on the line with the contact at the insurance company. So we get a hold of them. They get us signed up for a breach coach or a forensics coach of some kind, depending on what the incident is. And usually it's a set of lawyers, or it's a forensics firm. And we talk to them. Okay, we've got this, and this, and this is all free. Well, generally it's free. As we're otherwise discussing this, they're just trying to help us determine if it's a real incident, if it's a real breach, if it's a real incident, if it's something that we have to think about later as a bigger issue.
Right.
So we do all that. That's usually your first consultation. Those are the people that we get on first, and they usually are very experienced in doing this stuff. They call in the right people for us. It's 24/7, kind of sounds like I'm an insurance salesman.
I know. It does. It sounds like you're definitely in full support.
I am, because when I call them, I'm in the middle of a problem and I need help. And that's what they're there for. And I have never had a bad experience. And maybe other people have, but I've never had bad experiences. So when I call them, I know that they're going to get me help. So, and I've done it everything from, we had something considered well, I won't say any names, but we had data loss and an incident, and then we had inadvertent access by someone in another incident. Completely different. One is, is it a breach or not? Or one of it is there a bigger problem or not? Both times, I had the right people on the phone. We went through it. They said, okay, what did you do? Here's this. And they were fine with it. And neither one of them actually cost us anything. There was no payouts. There was no breach notification. We were able to determine it was not an incident of, it didn't actually turn into an incident. So those are the sorts of things that I deal with on a daily basis, or not a daily basis, but a regular basis for insurance.
Right. Yeah, I think too, it sounds like having a good relationship with your insurance contact is really critical, so that when something does happen and you're in, emergency mode, it's a little easier to deal with. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a friend of mine who years ago, he was taking his car into the mechanic. And someone was asking, oh, well, what do you haven't done? Oil change or this? He goes, no, I'm having a problem with my transmission or this. I do my oil changes myself. And the guy says, that really kind of sucks for your mechanic, because you always take it in when there's problems instead of taking it in when you have an oil change or a tire rebalance or whatever. Those are bread and butter. You're building that relationship with that individual. And I think about that when I deal with vendors, I deal with insurance. I like to engage with them. I like to, call them up and talk with them on like a tabletop exercise or a scenario. I get to know them, they get to know me, but it builds that relationship with that organization so that when a problem does arise,
right.
I know who to call. They know me. We can engage. And I said earlier about I did that panel about cyber insurance.
Yeah.
And that was our insurance guy. Our liaison is the one that did that with me. And it was a great interaction because he got to tell on the insurance side of the story and I could tell the CISO side of the story. So it was a good combination. But if you don't do that, you're not building that reputation, that relationship with
right.
them. And, it just makes it a little bit harder when you do need them.
Yeah. So let's talk about any past kind of war stories and how you dealt with them it sounds like you've had a number of incidents, but it doesn't necessarily have to be with the University of Tulsa. But I think the audience likes to hear, what happened, how you addressed it, kind of maybe one of your more interesting stories. I'd love to hear how you share it.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, when you kind of mentioned that you might ask me that question. And I have one. I haven't told it publicly because there was a lot of pieces to it. But a few years ago, so this will be the first time I really talk about it publicly. Okay. So a few years ago, my department was contacted by our local campus security, and they called up and says, "Hey, we've got some detectives here from the local PD here in town, and they need some help. They have some questions. Would you be able to come over and meet with them?" Absolutely. If campus security calls, we try to be as, over there as soon as we can. So I got over there and they were asking a whole bunch of technical questions. And I'm like, okay, well, this is kind of strange. This is not the type of questions. They were talking about tracking cookies and websites and various things. Like, well, this is not really something that usually we get questions on at this level. I was like, well, wait a second, guys. What is it you're trying to do? Well, it turns out we had been having a problem on campus for about a year and a half for a serial home invader. So we had someone who was breaking into women's apartments here on campus and doing a variety of things. And they felt like it may have been a student. They didn't know. But the timing was, it happened in the fall, it happened in the spring, it didn't happen in the summer, then it happened in the fall again. And so they felt like it was probably, the student timeline of someone is here, but they hadn't been able to catch. They had cameras out, they were trying, they couldn't find them. But they felt like some of the female athletes were the ones being targeted. So they wanted to put some tracking cookies on the websites to kind of find out who was looking at those public pages.
Right.
Well, that's a little harder than it sounds in terms of putting tracking cookies on our website, because our website is actually hosted in one state, it's managed from another state, and neither one of those states is Oklahoma. So we couldn't really do that. But I was like, well, let me ask you, what is it you're trying to do? And they said, well, we're just trying to find them. We're trying to find out who this is. I was like, well, do you have a date and time this happened? And they go, yeah, we've the last one happened at such and such. Like, well, why don't I just tell you who was in the room? And of course, they're all sitting there like, you can do that? It's like, well, I don't know, but I may be able to. So they gave me a date and a time, and I went back into our logs and we looked to see, because most rooms have a wireless access point in it. So I was able to tell them, okay, well, these are the devices that they're connected to the access point at that date and time, 2:00 in the morning, middle of the night. I was like, do you have a second day? And then I can, then we can cross-check to see, if there's anything. And give me a second day. Now, we only have so many logs. We only have a couple of months of logs by policy. So I only had a couple of months of time that I could really, track this down. So they gave me a second date, and I did the same process. We tracked down who was connected to the access point at the time, and we had a corresponding MAC address. We had a corresponding device. Well, the detective comes back. Now, they're all kind of ecstatic because within about 4 hours, we had a name. Wow. Within a day, we were pretty sure of that device and that name. But they found me a third event. The detective went back and going through all the logs and all the calls, and he got a third event. And same thing. We went, we found who was connected, we found the device. It was the same device registered with the same name. So it was enough for the detective to get a search warrant. So they got a search warrant. They came onto campus. At the time, we kind of used the same technology we were using to track this down, to tell them exactly where this device was on campus. So the detective and their SWAT team, they busted down the door. They went in. They captured all the devices in that room of 4 or 5 different individuals. Well, when they captured the devices, if they'd done it so fast, the devices were still logged in. They still had, they were still accessed. So they got it in, Faraday bags. They collected it. They took it back to their forensics. Turns out this was not a serial home invader. It was a serial rapist. This person had been raping these women who were passed out, and he had videos on his phone of doing this. So, of course, they did a search, or they did an arrest warrant, or they got an arrest order. They went after him. He had ran. He was now down in Texas. There was all bits and pieces.
Wow.
But the detective came back and he says, "Listen, I've got another problem." And it's like, okay. He goes, "Well, we don't know who these women are. We've got their video. Can you do the same process that you did to track down who these people might be?" And we did, and we had to find these young women, and the detective had to go out and literally catch them in class because, trying to find them.
Right.
Let them know that they had been raped, and then showed them the video, and they had no idea.
Oh my gosh.
So this person, this whole process the beginning process took us a couple of days to have it all happen, but then it strung out over a few years. Not last winter, but the winter before last. So this would have been December of 2019. The person pled guilty to, I believe, 25 counts of felonies, 25 felonies. He is in jail for a very long time.
Wow.
He got, I don't remember the numbers, but something like 120 years in prison, and he's got to do 35 consecutive,
Right.
But he's going away for a long time.
Wow.
And, that's one of those stories that not very often do technical people, CISOs and IT security, have to do those sorts of things that have that direct impact to the students like that. These young women who were being raped by multiple people in the room. And this person was recording it on his phone. I mean, he had videos, and it was a pretty bad situation. I'm proud of my team, and I'm proud that we were able to help. We were able to find that. We had to go to court. We had to testify. We had to do all this stuff.
It's a lot of responsibility, but it's really worth it, right? And
it is
great. That's a great outcome for that. But wow, I mean, you think about fighting the cyber criminals, and you're using the same type of skills, right, and technology to do this. It's wow, that's super interesting. Well, as we close out the interview here, it's been amazing, and just sort of ending on a lighter note, I'd love to hear what you do when you're not in CISO mode, because obviously, as you just told that story, super stressful, ultimately in the end, good outcome, but it puts a lot of stress on you and people in your cybersecurity role. It's they don't sleep at night. There's a lot on your mind, a lot of pressure. So what do you do when you're not in CISO mode to unplug and find inspiration?
Well, I think I mentioned earlier, I do martial arts. I've been doing that for a very long time. I have a small class that I teach on Saturdays. That helps a lot. The other thing that my wife and I are doing is we're actually getting our pilot's licenses. We want to, our kids are getting a little older. We want to travel some, and we decided a couple of years ago that we wanted to get our licenses and buy a plane so that we can travel around the country with the kids and do different things. And we actually put ourselves a timeline. So we want to fly to, the next eclipse, the eclipse of the sun.
Yeah.
We've got, I think it's 2023 or 2024, but we want to have a plane, and we want to fly to where it'll be full coverage.
Wow.
So that's the plan. That's what I've been working on. That's what we have been working on. And hopefully this it'd be this coming summer, or next summer.
Right.
We'll purchase an airplane, and we'll get our hours in, and we'll be able to do that coming in the next 2 years for that
Wow.
eclipse.
That's great. Well, I can't wait to hear all about that. When I was a young kid, my parents had a plane, and we went camping. We went camping,
Yep.
and it was exhilarating flying and landing. As a kid, I was a passenger, but
Sure.
landing in these small strips, and I still have vivid memories of it. But that's amazing. I also love writing goals down and planning for that. So that's amazing. So that's very impressive. And I can't wait to hear and see the pictures from when you do that trip with the full eclipse.
Absolutely. That'd be a lot of fun.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And for those listening in, thank you for your time, and look forward to seeing you on the next episode of CISO Perspectives. Thank you very much.